I'm here with Pastor J.D. Greer. Well, I'm really excited about having this time with you. I mean, this is a subject matter that is important, this is important for us as a country. I mean, to deal with it, specifically as a church. Too oftentimes, you talk about the idea of the church being divided, and it's reflecting a lot of what the world looks like. And,
right. Yeah, we ought to be out ahead, but sometimes it seems like we're behind in the conversation.
Yeah, and that just kind of helps even frame this whole section about being undivided. But oftentimes, when people get a caricature or a picture of the church, it looks more of the divided. It's us arguing with one another. And so over this course of this time, I just really wanted to kind of unpack, what does it look like for us as churches, two churches that are dealing with the tension that we have, this divide that we have in America, or specifically in how our church is handling it. We're coming at it from two different vantage points, but both committed to multi-ethnic, multicultural ministry. How do you, when did it become a passion for you, a burden for you to even address this issue?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question because you and I, we have a lot in common because we both, we love the gospel. We have Southern Baptist churches. We're very committed to this. But for one to understand about your church, it is what do you call it, minority-majority church, which means that the majority of the people there are minorities. We are, I think the last number I saw was 83% are Anglo and 17% are non-Anglo, and I've heard that the cutoff is 20%. Like 20% makes you a multi-ethnic church. So we're not quite there yet. I think you guys are, but it's something that's very important to us. We're committed to it. It really, there's two or three things that really triggered it for me. One is just recognizing God's intention for the church as expressed in the Bible. I mean, Paul didn't go into an area and plant, a church for the Jews over here and a church for the Gentiles over here and hope one day that they would, talk. He planted churches and wrote letters that talked about how races get along. And that's what we see in Acts, what we see in Galatians is just the tensions of doing that. So one was that. Second was a realization that there are few things that are as evangelistically compelling in our culture as seeing genuine gospel community, right? Because, the world, they long for it and they know how to put a good show on it. But in the news, we're always having things come out, whether it's, implicit bias in Hollywood or whether it's, troubling things in the legal system. And we just got to confess that despite our best intentions, it hadn't been able to be achieved. And there's something that we have resources in the gospel that are able to say what you want to do, what the law declares. The law is like we should be a multi-ethnic community where people love each other and get along and treat each other as equals. That's what we want to do, but we don't have the power to do it, and the gospel gives us that power. A third, honestly, Dottie, is we've just genuinely, as our church and many of my personal friends, are people of color. We've learned at our church genuinely to love those brothers and sisters. And we want to bear the burdens that they bear that some of us in the majority culture have never really had to experience. We want our church to feel as much like their church as we do. We want them to feel like guests, and so it's just saying, okay, what does it look like to be one united people in the body of Christ and to really be what Paul was talking about and what Jesus was praying for in John 17. And one of the lines that we use at our church is the church ought to reflect the diversity of the community, meaning that we're trying to reach everybody. And for us, it's the Raleigh-Durham area of North Carolina. We're trying to reflect the diversity of the community and how we reach out, but we're also trying to proclaim the diversity of the kingdom. Because one day in heaven there's going to be people of every tribe and tongue, and we want the church as much as it can to give a glimpse of that glorious multi-ethnic community. So that's when it became important. If you're looking for a timeline, I've been a pastor now for 16, going on 17 years. There was never a time when it wasn't like something that we believed, but I'd say probably in the last 6 or 7 years is when it's really taken a pretty sharp turn in terms of its importance in our church, and a lot of that has come through just relationships as I'm getting to know people.
That's what I was going to ask you. I mean, was it an event? Was it a thing can you put your finger on the point? Is this one of those kind of events or markers that you said, we got to address this in a real way? It's always been kind of up there,
right?
But we have to go all out.
So no, I mean, there have been small events along the way. I remember an African-American brother in our church probably 10 years ago. He just said, he says, man, I love the church. I'm here because of the preaching of the word. My soul is fed. I love the community. He said, but I want you to know that there are some I just feel like a guest here, and I need to know if this is on your radar. And I remember thinking, why does he feel like that?
Right.
We've had people, along the way, pastors that have been on our staff that have just said, hey, there's a community out here that is struggling. And me just being totally unaware with it, and why isn't this part of our church? Why isn't it growing and developing? And a lot of it was because of just some, I think, deafness and blindness. I definitely started in what they call the colorblind stage, which is like, oh, we should all just nobody should notice color. We should do what children do, and that is they ignore colors altogether, and they just and there's something innocent, but we live in a world where God has created the diversity of cultures, and if we're trying to get everybody to act like they're just white Americans, that's what I find many people, especially in the majority culture, think is they don't want a multi-ethnic church. They want a multicolored church where everybody acts like they're in, the white culture, and that's different. If you're going to be a part of a multi-ethnic church, it means you're going to be uncomfortable. That's kind of the measure of it. Are you committed to go through the uncomfortable conversations and changes in style and that sort of thing?
And that brings us to a good point, just to ask the question. Like, you talk about kind of the spectrum of the gospel community spectrum, right? And you guys kind of get phases because there's so many different people in so many different phases of where they are. Like, some people may be on one phase and some people may be on a different phase. I know you're familiar with Dr. George Yancey's book, Beyond Racial Gridlock. I mean, it's a great book, and we've used it as our church, and we had our whole church kind of like, you guys need to buy this book, you need to look at it, because so that we can see the different vantage points of where you're coming from. Right, and just being able to address this issue. And what it did, it gave us some light into seeing, from the majority culture usually looks at this issue from this vantage point, where the minority culture looks at it from a different vantage point. And he talks about kind of how minority cultures typically use it more from a systemic kind of way, where kind of the majority culture looks at it from more of a relational, individual. I'm not a racist, so therefore there's no racism.
There's no problem.
Where minorities are looking at it, but this is a systemic issue, and we're living in that systemic issue. And then it is this interesting kind of, when you talk about the different models and just the different vantage points, so you mentioned the colorblind model. One of the things that constantly came up in our church, especially for those in the colorblind, was like, there is a problem I might recognize, but part of the problem is that we keep bringing up this problem. Like, we need to stop
being divisive about it.
Stop being divisive, stop talking about it, stop. And that's
which is easy for somebody that's in a position of let's just call it privilege to say, right? Because and so so you alluded to this, and this is obviously what the study over the next several weeks is about. We've identified 4 stages in this gospel community spectrum, kind of 4 areas of development. The first stage is ignorance, just unaware of what's going on. Then the next stage is awareness, where you understand there's a problem and you want to see us overcome it. Then you've got intentionality, which is where you're committed to pursuing the relationships that lead to the 4th stage, which is gospel community, which is what we believe that what Jesus was praying for, what the Apostle Paul was instructing his churches to grow in.
So what would you say to the pastor that is saying, I know that there's a problem out there in the world, but that's not a problem in our church. Why do we need to, why do we need to address this? So I mean, what is the
I'll answer from my perspective, and then I'd love to hear what you say to it. So from my perspective, a lot of times that is from, let's just say, a well-intentioned majority culture person. They don't have many friends with people of color and don't really perceive that even in a country that has laws as fair and just as ours, and with the values we have, that the experience of growing up as a person of color in our country is still different than growing up in the majority culture. As I've gotten to know friends, people of color, they tell me stories that I'm like, that I know they're not making that up, and I've never had that experience. When I've been pulled over by the police, no, one of those times have I ever thought, this is because of the color of my skin, and I've never, but my friends, they can tell me stories of that. These stories of being followed in a store, And
I think that's critical, because like, I have the total opposite. Literally, when I'm driving and my wife is in the car and I get pulled over, my wife taps my hand. She taps my hand and says, "Dahadi, calm down. Calm down." Because there's anxiety that bubbles up in me. Because I've been pulled over by the cops. I've had guns pulled on me. by the cops, and just simply because I was black.
Right.
And so it is. And so like literally there was a person in my church that was a cop, and I have to tell you, I had to go to him and says, I just want you to know, you wearing that uniform, it does something to me. Because I don't have a good picture of what cops, when I see cops, I don't get protection and freedom and those things. And those types of things play into the kind of this conversation. And so that's when you talk about black and white or black and blue, and these kind of these tensions.
Right.
I think that's critical for us to be able to acknowledge it. And it wasn't until I was willing to acknowledge that I have this, even from my own side as a minority, to address this. And I think it's so, you talked about, like, let me answer that same question, is I think we have to address it because we all have these types of stories. And we're pastoring churches, especially if we're trying to get a multi-ethnic church that has these stories.
Right.
And when we have these stories, we got to recognize that we're not all coming with the same perspective.
Right.
We're not all coming with the same mindset.
Yeah, and there are historic realities that inform, and we didn't just show up here in America and whatever year you were born. We're part of a culture that has a history, and history has a long memory.
Yeah.
And there are things that we just need to understand about one another. The dividing line in this issue is not between conservative and progressive solutions to the problem. The dividing line is between people who understand and are aware that this is an issue and care about it, and those who don't.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, Galatians 6:2, bear the burdens of your brothers and sisters.
Right.
If I am your brother, then I'm going to want to know, why do you feel that anxiety?
Right.
And where is that? And I'll ask you challenging questions, you'll ask me, but it's just part of loving each other.
Yeah.
You really see this as a gospel issue, don't you?
I think a lot of times we miss this idea in the gospel in the idea of reconciliation. I mean, you see that in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, that he's given us the ministry of reconciliation, that God is reconciling the world to himself. I really believe, books like the book of Romans, the book of Galatians, like we talked about, the book of Ephesians, is answering these questions that are dealing with racial tensions in reconciliation in unity. And this is the very essence of why you see Paul rebuking Peter. Says he's not walking in step or in line with the gospel. What was he addressing? He was addressing a racial issue, right? And he says, Peter, you're not walking in line of the gospel. This idea of reconciliation and unity, that Christ is reconciling all things to himself. And another one that I would say is Ephesians chapter 2, when he says, for we are saved by grace, not by our works. It's a gift of God, not of works, so that no man could boast. But we were created for good works, that we are his poema, his workmanship. What is his workmanship? That he's torn down the dividing wall between Jew and Gentile. And so this is a gospel issue. And this is why we casually talk about the Revelation 7 passage. But I really believe that the Revelation 7 passage is a picture.
It's a result of the, right.
of gospel being worked out.
Sounds like you've taught through this before.
A couple of times.
Couple times.
I'm really excited to get into these next few sessions and being able to continue this type of conversation because, like you stated earlier, this is a gospel issue. As you quoted, like in Galatians, in Ephesians, in Romans, I really think over and over again, it's addressing the issues of race. So as we kind of journey in, and getting a chance to share these kind of our stories of how we get a chance to engage with our churches in this area, I'm really excited about. Hopefully it can be helpful and engaging for others.
It'll be a good conversation anyway.
Amen.